need to build it first. And you know what I mean by build it. We need to decide a few different parameters, and we're going to go through these parameters like in a little bit more detail in these slides. Then we have to train the network, which means we use a supervised learning type of paradigm. We identify a training set that we give to the network with a series of images and of labels, so that the network can input the image, can go through the processing that it does, which involves calculating derivatives and summation function and applying the chain rule, and then spits out a prediction, which again, it will compare to the label to identify if it's doing a good job or not. There is a third step, which is testing the network, because we give a certain specific data sets to the network might become really good at identifying what is in our training data sets, but might not be as good to identify data that it has never seen before. In that case, we give another training network so that we can test if the network actually is doing a good job. And in the end, we converge on a network that satisfies our criteria, which is good enough for what we want to do. And then, of course, like we use it to solve the problem with new data sets that this time are unlabeled. So let's go through the first part. We want to build the deep neural network. We have to define the different parameters of the network. So we need to define the features of the input, what the network is really going to look into or trying to find in the data that we will pass through the network itself. We need to define the activation function of the different nodes, and you know what it is from this morning. We need to decide the number of nodes of hidden layers and hidden nodes. And when I say number of nodes, I mainly say the number of output layer and the output of input layer nodes are sort of defined. The input layer by the feature of the data that we pass. For example, remember before, if we have a 16 by 16 pixel image, we will have 256 nodes here. Here, if we have a binary decision, we can have 2 nodes so that we can have one active and the other inactive if it's one category and the other way around. The number of hidden layers and hidden nodes is actually something that is difficult to predict directly, but we're going to see it now in a moment. We decide the values of the bias and we decide the weights. And this is going to be the part about the weight, the part where we're really going to train our neural network, because we have seen this morning, the weights are the way in which a neural network can get better. Like changing the weights of the connection between nodes is the way in which a neural network can get better with time. So the first part is the features, also known as parameters or variables, that, for example, if you're trying to predict how much now a car should cost based on the date in which was fabricated, the amount of usage that it has, the person that was using it, the road, the state of the roads in the country where it was used, those all would be like sort of individual features. These are the factors that the machine looks at when you give a certain input. And choosing them right might be really one of the most important things that you do when you train the neural network. You will see that a lot of parameters are actually sort of fixed in the sense that you give them or you try them out to see which one works better. But selecting the right data sets and having the right data sets for training and selecting the right features is really critical. The activation function is, again, something that we have gone through today. The only thing that you need to remember is to choose the activation function wisely, meaning that you have different one at your disposal. And depending on which one you use, you can approach different type of problems. If you use the linear function, for example, or the step function, you can get like very simple processes to the problem to be solved. If you want to have more complex non-linear problems, you might change the activation function that you're using. You're going to be playing with all these parameters and setting them up later when you're going to be on the playground on the TensorFlow website. You can use multiple activation function in a network. For example, all of them have one activation function, and then your output has a different activation function. You have to decide the number of nodes and layers, and there is an optimum. As I said before, it's a Gaussian distribution. Usually what you do to decide this, what you do is that you basically like try. It's not a, there are calculations that are involved with that, but I think that it's like beyond the scope of this blog course to just go through the mathematics of the neural network, which is something that we are not really touching upon. We have to decide the bias, and usually at the beginning, either 1 or -1. Again, this is a way to move basically the activation function and to change its value. In practice, is a trick to use to be able to train the neural network in an efficient way. So this is something that is usually decided at the beginning, and it stays constant to through the training. The thing that changes through the training is the weights, and the weights are first random numbers, and then these weights are fine-tuned to optimize the performance of the network. And the fine-tuning process that happens through this supervised learning process that I was telling you before, and that we're going to go into details now, it's what it means to train a neural network to perform a certain function. Okay, so like a lot of things that you have to set up, and then you run the training step. The training step means finding for each of the connection, meaning for each of these edges, the values of the weights that maximize the output of the network. Now, because you have a set of data sets that is labeled, you know what you give into the network, the input, you know what it should come out from the output. The nutshell training of the neural network is that you give an input, you see what the network says. If you calculate how much what the network outputs is different for what it should actually output, which is the label that you already have attached to the data point, and then you use that value to tweak these weights in order to make things better and to reduce the error between the output of the network and what the output should actually be. This is what Nuno was asking today when he was asking about, what is a reward. Decreasing the error, or what you will see today in the playground, the loss, is basically the reward that the network wants to achieve. So the idea would be that when you give an output of 5, you give an input that is an image of a number 5, the output will be 5. Of course, as we were also saying today, there is quite, let's say, complicated architecture for solving problems. We're gonna have a mock example on the very simple one that I've said before, but this is just for you to know that this is the real network architecture that can solve the problem of identifying which is this handwritten digit. That is to basically, like, it's a network that has been trained on the MNIST dataset, which is a dataset that includes a lot of this handwritten digit with their labels, to basically be able to be applied to a number of a new image in order to label which number and identify which number is there. So this is the reality. Now we go through the mock practice that is going to be based on our small neural network here that we use to identify which are the elements of the network. We go with the first one, is build the network. First step of the training is build the network and assign random values to the weights. This is what they've done before. You have to select all the different variables that we have defined before, the activation function, the bias, the number of nodes, and so on. And now you assign to each one of these weights here, even the one with the bias, a random value. And a random value usually is basically you set up this random value to be picked from a normal distribution, which can be centered around different values. Now, normally this normal distribution, sorry for the alliteration, can be centered around 0, which means, to go back to the question that Anna was asking today, that the weights can be negative. So it is possible that there are weights that define that the output of one node is going to be decreasing the output of the following node instead, or the input, sorry, of the following node instead of increasing it. The point is that if this is actually an interneuron, it's more complicated. And that's why the question of Anna today was a little bit more complicated to explain in this term, because imagine that the output of, for example, one node is negative, and then the weight is negative, the multiplication of this would be positive, and that would actually increase the input of the other neuron. So it all depends from the way in which this is built, at least from my interpretation. Once you have assigned weights, random numbers to the different weights that of your network, you're able to start the training of the network. And in this case, what you do is that you provide a training datasets. You define how much you split your labeled datasets in two parts. One part that you use for the training, and one part that you use for the testing later on. And the part of the data sets that is used for training, you give it to the network now. The network will start going through a batch of these data points, in our case, a batch of images of handwritten digits, and perform the type of propagation and backpropagation that I'm going to show you now. The reason of doing or not doing like the fine-tuning of the weights or the calculation of the error at every image, although would be probably more precise, is that you would increase enormously the amount of time that it takes to train the network. So you can distinguish and can decide the batch of images that the network runs through before it actually goes back and tweaks the weight. This is also a parameter that you're going to be able to change in the playground today. So what you do, you give a batch of images. For example, we have here a picture of the number 5 and the label that tells to the network that it should say 5 through this, as it should attach the label 5 to this particular image. So what the network does is take the image, put the image through the network in a feed-forward fashion. This is called, in fact, feed-forward propagation. So to calculate what it should input based on the way in which the weights have been assigned before and the weight, the random weights basically will work. So at every step, as you saw before, the output of one neuron is going to be combined by the weight of that particular connection and is going to be inputted to the other neuron that is downstream in the artificial neural network. This neuron will sum up the different values that it gets from the neurons it's connected to, pass it through the activation function, and again, move to the next step. Again, this is something that you don't need to know mathematically. You just want to know that the network passes the images in a feed-forward fashion to the output neuron and is able to output a value, or in that case, it's actually a vector, or let's say a label that say this is something. It's not going to be, of course, precise. It might start saying that this is a 9 instead of saying that this is a 5, or it might say that it's something that is not even a number, right? The important point is that at that point, since the network knows, because we gave the label that is associated to this image, it should know what it should impact. The network can calculate how much something is different from 5, which is the label that we had assigned to the original image. So it can make a calculation, because both these labels are expressed numerically, to say, I am mistaken. The answer that I should give is not something, it should be 5, and I'm mistaken by this much, which is again a quantity that the network is able to calculate at the end of the feed-forward propagation step. At this point, the network is going to do something that is very interesting, that is called backpropagation, which means that it's going to take this total error and calculate how much of these weights have contributed to the total error that the network has actually been making at the end of the feed-forward computation. So you give the image goes through the feed-forward propagation step, the output is calculated, the output is wrong. We know how much it is wrong because it can be compared to the label, and through a complex calculation that requires calculating partial derivatives, applying the chain rules and so on, which again, you don't need to know. If you want to know, ask me and I will send you references to read about that. You can actually define how much each of these individual weights has contributed to the total error. Okay? At this point, another expression that you might have heard before starts, which is what is called gradient descent, meaning that the network will try to tweak the weights in a way that will allow it to descend, to make it basically like learn and reduce the error that has been calculated, that reduces the error in a new example. So basically, you know how much each weight contributes. You start to change a little bit the value of these weights, so that this value, the combination of these values, will give a smaller error into the next step, into the next iteration. Is this something that is clear in principle of how it works? Because this is really like the key principle of training a neural network. You basically assign random values of the weights. You know how much your weight is off, your result, is off. Then you go back, you assign every individual weights with a contribution to this total error, and then you try to minimize the total error by tweaking the value of the individual weights. Now, there is one thing that you can decide at this moment, and this is the learning rate. So what you're trying to do now is to go down and to converge onto a value for which your total error is actually minimal. You can understand and you can basically control how fast this learning process goes. And this is what we say when we say that what we do when we minimize the error is to try to not find and not get stuck into a local minimum of the error function, which is plotted here as this profile, but in a global minimum, which is the best solution for your network. If you come here, for example, you start with a network that is this value and then start go down and you're stuck in this point, of course, you think that you have found a local minimum, but actually you haven't. Sometimes what it happens is that there are steps in which the network is actually trying to actually initialize to move a little bit further out of this local bump so that you can see if it always will continue to converge into this local bump, it means that's the global minimum, otherwise that's a local minimum. We need to choose a method that basically like the speed to which this process of going down goes, or if you want the step that the learning function actually will take. And this is the learning rate, which is a value that speeds up or slow down how quickly an algorithm learns. There are multiple theories how to select it. In most cases, it depends on trial and error. I'm sure that this can be optimized. Everything that is good can be made better in engineering time. So I think that this can be optimized. But however, if you want to understand what difference does it make between a big learning rate and a small learning rate, this is a visual example that can guide you how to do. If you have a big learning rate, you might jump from one part of the curve to the other part of the curve, but never really converge on the local minimum. If you have a small learning rate, you instead can flow smoothly toward the global minimum. Okay? Usually, as a rule of thumb, you start with learning rate that is quite small, but not too small, because you can think, okay, let's put it as small as we can. Okay, remember, taking and making things more and more precise means that you need more computational power and more time. And this is something that you, of course, also want to minimize when you're training your neural network. So you start with small values, and then you try to converge to 0. Okay? So the neural network has gone through our phase of getting the input, passing the input through feed-forward propagation to the output, see how much the output is different from the answer that it should actually give, calculate the total error, backpropagate so that it can distribute this error along the different weights, and do gradient descent to minimize, to choose values of weights that minimize the total error in the end. One batch is over, then now it moves through the other batch of the datasets that you will give him and does this over and over and over again until all the datasets, data point of the training datasets that you gave to the network to train the network are actually passed through. Of course, you see, now it doesn't start at something because he has a little bit of an indication of what it actually should do because the weights are already a little bit tweaked before. All right, this phase has basically like finished the training phase. It will get better and better and better as we go and basically like move through different batches of images of the training datasets. The loss, which is this error, will be minimized, will be further and further reduced as much as we go during the training of the algorithm. And what we say, at a certain point, the network converge onto an architecture that is a set of weights that will basically be good enough to assign a label which is not too far away from the label that it should be given. At this point, and I was saying before, you go through the testing dataset, which is a series of datasets that the network has not seen before, so that you avoid overfitting the network to the sample datasets that you've given to train the network. Can this network generalize of new data, which are of the same type of the one that you have given to train the network, so that if you give another image of 5, it's going to be actually really be able to output 5, and it doesn't start back to saying 0. Once also this difference converge, meaning that the network is good not only because it predicts the right labels on the training datasets and predicts the right label on the testing datasets, you're good to go. You're able to apply to unlabeled data, to something that has been basically like new to the network, and the network should give an answer which is precise. Of course, it might give an answer that is not precise, and if it doesn't give an answer that is not precise, it's most likely because you have either created a network architecture that is not really good at solving the problem that you have basically given to the network, because you've chosen the wrong activation function, or because the training has been stuck on a local minimum, or because the training has been overfitted only to the datasets that you've given for training and testing, and so on and so forth. If it's not good at that moment, then you go back and you change your architecture and see what happens at that moment. Is the rationale by which neural networks are trained clear? Because mathematically, it's complex. I can tell you there is a lot of maths going on and involved in calculating the error and distributing the error to the individual weights. But I find the rationale by which this happens very, very easy or intuitive to understand. Since later you will have to tweak all the elements that I just told you about to find neural architecture of neural networks that are able to solve problems. I really need to know that you have understood the individual points and know that what you basically would do if you wanted to get a neural network to behave better or worse for a specific problem. And this is something that you can play with later on, and you will have to write your answers on the lab book, but this is something that Daniel is going to explain in a moment. I will go on now if there are no questions. Okay. So this is more or less an evaluation from a computer science perspective. Deep neural network have been a smashing success. They've allowed the development of algorithms for self-driving cars, entertainment, visual recognition, virtual assistant, fraud detection, and so on and so forth. These are really like all applications in which neural network have revolutionized, I would say, the life that you do every day, because you use few of them at every moment in time, even when you're using just your earphone to cancel out noise from the outside world, right? So from a computational computer science perspective, this is massive success. From a neuroscience perspective, it's also very good because you have been seeing before how a neural network, like something like the one that we built, of course, a lot more complicated, has been able to reproduce process of learning, has been able to beat Lee Sedol in 2016 at Go. And it gets better and better every time. So at this point, these board games might actually be solved from that point of view. But there is a good thing, like, we have reproduced in silico a way of learning something that is able to create a machine which is excellent and doing what it does. Are we sure that the brain learns in the same way that we have built an artificial neural network to actually learn? In other words, this is where the debate is right now. Yes, machine can learn, but are we really approximating or reproducing the same way in which our brain learns? Or is it a different thing? Is it that we call them neural network because they remind us of neurons and synaptic connection and nodes and layer and whatever you want to call them, but it's actually something very different from the brain? And this is really actually like a hot topic, both in the neuroscience and the computational world. If you open Twitter and follow a few of the most prominent figures of these fields, they're actually really daily struggling and fighting each other. But let's put a little bit things in context. So this is really, there is a lot of work right now going on to trying to understand if the way in which deep neural network learn actually really recapitulates or is a good model for how the brain learns. Deep neural network learn in 3 steps. One, they're able to calculate the error between what they're supposed to output and a real output. This is fundamental. If they were not able to do that, they were not able to change the weights of their connectivity in order to get better. The second, they are able to perform backpropagation to distribute this error on individual weights of the different link. And of course, they have a way to update the weights in order to get better, to minimize the error and to converge on a minimal loss. Do we find these three elements in the brain? Does the brain uses these three different things, able to calculate the error, able to perform backpropagation, and able to update the weights in order to learn to do something? As far as the first part goes, we know from 1997 that there is indeed some neurons of the brain which are responsible or are able to encode in their activity the possibility of the fact of finding an error in what you predict. So dopaminergic neurons are able to predict the outcome of a task and signal an error if the outcome of that task does not match what has been predicted. These are recordings from a rat, I think, or a monkey. I'm not entirely sure at the moment. What they saw is that if the monkey is given a signal, which is called predictive stimulus, followed by reward at a certain point, the dopaminergic neuron will happen in three different times, in three different ways. At the beginning of learning, the animal does not really know that that predictive stimulus is going to predict a reward after a certain latency. And when the animal finds rewards, it's surprised. There is an error. It wasn't expecting a reward, but it's getting a reward. So what happens is that the firing rate of this dopaminergic neuron will increase and see a bump. During training, or after the task is learned, if the animal receives the rewards, it can already predict that something good is going to happen. And you see here a bump of activity of the dopaminergic neuron at this moment. But if that something good is going actually to happen, so there is a reward here, the dopaminergic neuron is not surprised anymore. So it doesn't change its firing. Because what it predicts, that there is a reward, is actually confirmed. Indeed, there is a reward. But if you fool the animal, and in some trials, you give the predictive stimulus, the dopaminergic neurons say, wow, fantastic, I'm gonna get my reward. But then you do not give the reward when the animal is supposed to get it. The dopaminergic neuron is surprised again and thinks, okay, something is gonna happen, something is happening. I was expecting a reward, I don't see any reward, what's going on? It will decrease its firing rate here. This was really like extremely, and it is still extremely influential discovery that people have started to debate a lot. The fact that dopaminergic neuron in the brain might convey an error signal that basically is able to signal again or encode information about something unexpected happening, meaning either the absence or the presence of reward when a reward was not expected or when a reward was expected. So there might be an error signal in the brain that is conveyed by population of neurons that express dopamine and releases dopamine, which is a neuromodulator, works like glutamine and GABA. You should know this from your basic courses. Okay, let's skip the second moment, the second point now, the backpropagation, and let's go to the possibility to update the weights. You have seen during your course of study and during Tuesday that indeed neurons are able to update weights with each other, and this depends on the timing of the spiking. So you can have LTP if the presynaptic neuron fired before the output spike of the postsynaptic neuron. You can have LTD if the presynaptic neuron fires after the postsynaptic neuron. So there is a way in which this can happen. Now, this is tricky because, right, you have an experience and then you should be able to calculate the error from the soma where the action potential is already going forward in the network. You should be able to transmit this to the dendrites. It doesn't really, during experience, there is not really a big window of time when this tweaking can happen. So when does it happen? The most important, let's say, the most prominent hypothesis at the moment is that this happens during sleep. I showed you on Wednesday that clay cells in the hippocampus are able to be reactivated in the same order that recapitulate the experience that the rat was doing when he was awake, the movement along the trajectory. We call that phenomenon of reactivation replay. It might be a way in which neurons are able to actually strengthen or decrease their connectivity in order to create those patterns of activity that then can be remembered later on and becoming the engram for a specific memory. So we not only know the mechanism by which the tweaking of the weights might happen, but also when it might happen, and this happens during sleep. In fact, if you interfere with replay during sleep without waking up the person, you just change the amount of replay that you have because you're able to change the brain waves that go on during sleep. An animal and a person does not really learn. So you give a person a task to do, then you disrupt its, they're called ripples, this moment in which replay happens. The person is not able to actually get better with time during training. And the same thing for rats where it was first explored. But the big question is, does backpropagation, so the ability to calculate the error and to go back in the synapses and update the weights based on the total measure of the error, happens in the brain? And this is where the field is sort of stuck, because the jury is still out on this one. Backpropagation trained model can explain the pattern of neural activity that we see in the brain. If we record from different areas of the cortex of the neuron, for example, visual area 1, V2, V3, 4, 5, and higher areas, if we include the possibility to perform backpropagation in the network, our models are able to be more precise in the way in which they explain the pattern of activity of the neuron that we observe, which is a very indirect way of thinking that, backpropagation might happen, because if you factor backpropagation in you're trying to explain how the activity happens, we are actually better at guessing the answer. How backpropagation might happen is actually quite ingenious and interesting. I've shown you this before. This is basically a graph of the cortical hierarchy. You have primarily sensory areas at the bottom and more cognitive areas like the hippocampus and the frontal cortex at the top. I've told you that connectivity goes from here up to here in a direct way. This is what we call the feed-forward pathway that goes from sensory organs to the brain. But what I didn't tell you, and I'm telling you right now, is that there is a clear connectivity that is just as strong in most times, not directly, but like through indirect ways, that goes from the higher the higher cortical area to the most elementary, or if you want, the most primary sensory areas of our brain. So there is an ascending feed-forward pathway and a descending feedback pathway. And those seem to converge even on individual neurons. So if you look at individual neurons in the primary sensory area, they get a feed-forward pathway from the sensory organs and also get a feedback pathway that is from the higher cognitive areas. The interesting thing that is emerging is that these two different pathways seems to converge onto two different compartments of the neuron. A neuron in the brain usually has a shape, the most common is the pyramidal neuron that you should know, that has basal dendrites and apical dendrites. The feed-forward pathway seems to go on the apical part of the dendrites, and the feedback pathway seems to go on the basal dendrite. So you can get feed-forward and feedback to talk with each other, which is fundamental for backpropagation and for tweaking the weights, by getting them to be active at the same time and to transmit information from the basal part of the cell to the apical part of the cell. And do you remember what I told you when I talked to you about interneuron? Interneurons are targeting either one or the other, or create different pattern of connectivity between this basal part and apical part. So they might be the one that control the communication between compartments and then tweak the balance between the feed-forward pathway that comes from the senses and the feedback pathway that comes from the cortical areas. This idea of backpropagation in the brain, again, is not established. It's still an hypothesis. There is a very nice Nature Review Neuroscience review where I took this picture that was published exactly last month, still with a question mark. So to tell you that the jury is really not out yet on this. This is a very interesting model of how this could happen, but it highlights another important point. We know about backpropagation based on the way in which we train neural networks. deep neural networks. And based on our computational modeling, we are looking if those computational tricks are actually used in the brain. And this, I think, nicely explicates one very important thing, that we started to build artificial machines that replicate some cognitive function to try to understand if what our understanding of the brain was actually correct. But now we can go from the other way around to use our an intelligent machine to understand more about the brain. Not only because we can use those algorithms to make sense of the data that we collect, this is in the second lecture, but also we can see if some trick that machine use and machine learning uses are actually something that biologically also the brain uses to learn about experience. So in the end, there is no one direction. It's all a ring, like the attractor of the MAC. Cool. So this completes this part and leaves you ready to perform your build and train your old deep neural networks. We're going to explain you the exercise right now so that you don't have to go and then come back in half an hour and then go again. It would be like a waste of time. But if there is any question about this, just now is the moment to ask them. Okay, super clear or super sleepy. I hope the first one. Okay, so now I leave the word to Daniel, who's gonna illustrate what you're gonna do. You have received all the assignment tasks in Adam. I uploaded it yesterday. So if you don't have that yet, you can go on Adam and just download it. One other thing about Adam, I've created a folder in which you can upload your lab notebooks. Remember to do it until Saturday. The lab notebooks is gonna be basically paired to the evaluation of your interaction during this whole week. And that's going to be a part of the way in which you're going to be evaluated with the exams of the 12th. We're going to go back in 2 hours for the wrap up of the week. And at that moment, I'll give you an example of one question that I might give you during your exam. Yeah.
How will this lab book influence our grade? In which way?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's gonna something that is gonna be incorporated in somehow. I have to coordinate with the other teachers, with the other professors. You have heard also last week from Fiona that this is something that we take into consideration, the participation. So exactly how this is something that we are gonna come up with. I was telling you again that, like, to me, I really want to get the sense from your lab book that you have understood the task at hand. They're not difficult tasks. They're not complex tasks. Understanding the principle is what really matters. And to me, that's the important part. Okay, so Daniel, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. So can you see my screen? Okay, so TensorFlow is a really powerful library for many numerical computations.
Daniel, we see Spider. We don't see the web page.
Why? And now?
No.
Okay, I'm gonna do it again, right? Not working. Why is it like this?
You have to choose the window that you want to.
Is it good now?
Yeah, we see TensorFlow. Yeah.
That's good. That this one I'm going to explain, right? And so TensorFlow is, I think, one of the biggest libraries for large-scale machine learning projects, including deep learning. It was developed by Google, and this is something that you're probably going to use if you do deep learning or machine learning tasks in the future, which many of you will do. So TensorFlow has a really nice application called the Playground, and this is just for you to get an intuitive understanding of how neural networks work. This is the playground. On the left, you can select different data sets. I selected now the most simple one, which you can see here, but there are also more and more complex data sets. You see blue dots and you see orange dots. These dots represent positive and negative values, and basically the task is for the neural network to learn to distinguish a boundary in which one side of the boundary it classifies an object as a blue dot, and on the other side of the boundary it classifies another object as an orange dot. You can change a lot of parameters. First thing you should do is to uncheck the regularization and the regularization rate, because this is something that we did not talk about, but if you're interested, you can also write and see what it is, basically. You can set the ratio of training to test data. I think in normal cases, it would be like 80% of the data is the training data and 20% is the test data. You can also make the data more noisy. And if you look at the right, you can see what that means. And you can also increase like the number of instances that would be put into the network, which is the exercise. All right, in the middle, you can add more hidden layers to the network. And also in each hidden layer, you can add more or less neurons. This is the input of the data, which is, in this case, it's very simple. It's just the coordinates of the x and x1 and the x2 axis, but you can add more complex inputs to the network. And on the right, you can see the output of the network, which is really intuitive because you can see the boundary of the classification task. Here, you can start the training. You can see the number of epochs that have passed. Also, you can set the learning rate from very low values to very high values. You can change the activation function. And in the exercises, you're going to do classification, but there is also possibility to do regression tasks with this program. If you click or move your cursor on one of these hidden layer neurons, you can see what the neuron outputs. And also, if you click on the connections, you see what the weight is of that connection, and you can tweak it. So just you can see what happens if you, for example, make this weight bigger. Your job will be simple. It will be to kind of mess around with it, with the data sets, and figure out, changing each of the parameters, what does it do in terms of the output. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, that above the output, you can see the loss for the training data and also the loss for the test data. And of course, the job is to minimize this loss. And we're going to have a little competition here. We're looking for good neural networks that can classify the most complex data sets, which is the spiral data set. And so in the lab notebook, if you send us your neural network that either has like the least amount of epochs, the fastest neural network, and also the most precise neural network that can classify these data sets, which is actually a really hard nonlinear data set to classify, will get special prizes, which is in discussion with Flavia what those special prizes might be, right?
Right.
Okay, so I guess that's kind of it. If you have any question, write to us and have fun.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So we are again, actually, let's do one thing. Like, I'll keep the big lecture hall open, and we're going to be there in the big lecture hall. It doesn't really make sense to divide into small groups for this, because you should really, like, TensorFlow itself, Google itself tells you that you cannot break the neural network. So no way to get stuck into something. As Daniel just said, please document this, take a snapshot of the neural network, of the architecture that you have built to solve the problem. That can tell us what is the weight of the individual edges and the parameters that you've used, and the loss, the total loss, both the training and the test loss, and put it in your lab book. And that's going to be the exercise for today. We're going to see each other. I think if everything goes all right, it should be 4, right? It should be 4 on the program. Okay, so we're going to see 4 on the program for a quick, let's say, I want to give you an alternative view of the brain in a very fast way. We're going to talk a little bit of probability. We're going to see something that I think you will find interesting during this day of lockdown, which is not totally related to the brain, but it's still useful. So still some interesting stuff to come. And as Daniel was saying, have fun. Don't break the internet, please. We still need it, but be creative. Find what you want with your